So a lot of people don't do any kind of directed mental activity for the sake of improving themselves. And this video is not for them. Um, this video is meant to talk to people who are already doing some kind of uh, directed mental activity for the sake of self improvement. And just to concretize that a little bit, that activity could be something like meditation. It can be something like various types of self expression. So, even though making art isn't always for the sake of improving the self, it can be done to improve the self. And so, even though it's not an only mental activity, it can also be considered as a mental activity and a directed one, by which I just mean one that is done intentionally. Writing, journaling, those count if largely, if they're for the purpose of improving the self, which they aren't always. Sometimes you want to communicate something to somebody else. Um, Sometimes you want to communicate something to somebody else in order to improve yourself. Abraham Lincoln supposedly would get really mad about stuff and write a whole letter to the other person, just, railing on them and talking about everything they'd done wrong. And then, as the story goes, he would then rip it up and not share it. That's more of a directed mental activity than a communicative one, but it involves these implements. And prayer is another one of these, and that's the one I want to talk about today. Now, a second caveat on this video. This video isn't necessarily for people who have a lot of objections to religious concepts or the idea of using God in prayer. Um, Full stop. Those topics are very complicated, and I take them very seriously, in large part because I spent a bunch of years where the majority, if not all, of my friends were pretty atheistic, and I personally respect atheism, I should say. So I intellectually respect it, which isn't to say that I think it's true. I don't know what's true. I'm confused about what's true. I don't want to put my stamp of endorsement or approval on like atheism full stop, because that means a lot of things to a lot of different people. I will just say that I am myself a naturalist, which is a way of saying that I believe that everything that exists can, at least in principle, be explained according to a natural set of laws rather than supernatural ones. Now, what's the difference between natural and supernatural? This is also complicated. I tend to think that supernatural is sort of a little bit of an attack category. A lot of times, supernatural means that the thing in question is supposed to intervene on the actual world from some other place. Now, if there were such things, I would think that they were natural. If there were an independent set of laws from the normal laws, the mundane laws, or something like that. If there was this, default set, whatever that means, and then there were a totally separate set, the supernatural laws, I would then say that the application of the term supernatural was excessive, because if both sets exist, then they are both understandable and in terms of a coherent framework. So anyway, that's a little bit of philosophical baggage that I maybe don't have to put out there, and it's very wordy. Point I'm trying to make is I'm just going to say some things about prayer right now. When you pray, especially if you pray to God, or you pray with the idea of God in mind, whatever that means to you, whatever definition you're using, people with a religious outlook tend to believe that if God exists, you're praying to something real. Now, it's interesting to me because, taking a philosophical angle on this, I think that a person only has the most direct access to things that are in their mind. So that is to say, I have a pencil here. Now, everything I'm most directly experiencing about this pencil is mental. The feeling of the wood or plastic or whatever this pencil is, and the metal and the lead, those feelings are in my mind. Notice I point to my brain, whatever. The light and the colors are being interpreted through my mind. So there's a sort of solipsistic take which is to say that everything that's going on with this pencil, as I possibly have access to it, is mental. That's not to say that the pencil doesn't exist. This is a very important thing that people mess up. So they tend to think that, there's this sort of simplistic take on solipsism, which is to say that the only thing that you ever encounter is mental, therefore the only things that exist are mental. The latter does not follow from the former, which is to say that just because you only ever interact with something via some means doesn't mean that the thing is not there. So, in other words, there's a pencil, damn it, right? And so now when we take it back to the idea of God, very interesting questions around, long-standing civilizational debate over thousands of years about whether God exists in the way that the pencil does, for realsies, right, actually out there in the world. I'm not going to try to answer that question right now. I'm just going to note that when you pray, if you pray to God, the thing that you are most directly interacting with, at least in the way that I am interacting with this pencil, the most direct access is through your mind. Mental experience is the medium through which we understand the world. Mental experience is the language, the only language we speak, you could say. And so, as far as improving one's mental practices, if you're the sort of person who does something like prayer, one thing I try to keep in mind for myself, because I was just trying to do some prayer just now and decided to make a video instead, is that if I find myself praying to God, I'm accessing that thing, if that thing exists, through God, right? This is the quotes. The quotes refer to my mental object. And if my mental object is wrong, right, then I'm not praying to the right thing. If you think that the idea of prayer is to reach the real entity out there. Just like, if I had some kind of brain lesion, if somebody was fiddling with my brain and I stopped being able to see the color and I stopped being able to feel the hardness of the object in my hand, and it felt fuzzy, or it seemed to be, green instead of, wood color. I think this is wood. Then you would think that there's some error going on. Likewise, there's a lot that's going on with this pencil that I'll never be able to perceive directly, modulo some kind of transhumanist brain enhancement where I can see other types of light, infrared light, and I can see, all the electrons, directly, maybe zoom into the kind of atomic level. And so this is all a very roundabout, and forgive me for being so wordy. I hope it's not too buzzwordy, because I try to keep this stuff accessible, even though I'm, being using a philosophy words. I want it to be something that can be understood. Otherwise, what are we even doing? I try to keep in mind that one of the purposes of prayer, at least one of the purposes of the way that I do prayer, is to improve my God concept. That means improve the concept that I access in my mind when I do the prayer activity. I'll note for the atheists in the audience, again, I may be among you. I'm a little bit confused about my actual perspective on this stuff. I'm withholding judgment, because I don't know, right? But for the atheists in the audience, you might find that it's useful to think about the idea of your best self. Maybe if you do some directed mental activity, like writing about how you might try to be in the future. You have this notion in your mind, my best self. Now, is my best self the same as your actual best self? Right? You have preconceived notions. You have illusions. You're trying to become things that you shouldn't try to become. Later in your life, if your investigations are successful, you'll find out, oh shit, I've been trying to become this person I never should have become in the first place. And you can ground this out when we're talking about mental activities, directed mental activities for the sake of self-improvement, by saying that whatever concepts, I'm a little bit riffing, I'm a little bit extemporaneous about this, so this might not come out perfectly right, but whatever mental concepts, whatever concepts we use in the course of mental practice, we should improve to correspond more and more directly to the real things they're supposed to refer to. In other words, if I were a scientist or an artist or a whatever, a mechanic studying the pencil, I would want my idea of the pencil to correspond more and more directly with the actual thing. If I were going about a spiritual quest that involved the idea of God or God, I would try to make sure that my idea, the thing in my mind, corresponded over time more and more closely to the actual thing. And those who believe in God tend to believe that there is an actual thing that has specific properties, right? It is some things and not others. Though, you try to put limits on God, and you're going to have trouble with that in most traditions. Trouble defining it. Or if I were doing one of these more atheistic approaches, looking to become my best self, I would want to make sure that this idea, my best self, was like the actual thing. Supposing that there is a thing that you in fact should become, and it may or may not be the same idea as you have in your mind. So I'm going to rewatch this and see if it made any goddamn sense, but I hope this is useful to someone.